by Dr. Jenny Booth from JNCC. So without any further delay, I'll hand over to her.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to everyone for joining. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the ecological complexity of mangrove forests and their ecosystem services, framing this within the scope of my PhD thesis on mangrove ecology. So the term mangroves can be used to refer to the trees themselves or the entire ecosystem. They're coastal or estuarine ecosystems, and they're particularly interesting because they're composed of terrestrial trees, which are adapted to live in the sea, and marine animals, which are adapted to live on land. So they really do represent a bridge between marine and terrestrial life. This map shows the distribution of mangroves along the tropical and subtropical coastlines of the world, and the colour represents the richness of mangrove species in different regions. So you can see in Southeast Asia, for example, there's a very high species richness of up to almost 50 species of mangrove, where it's dark red. And they're found in sheltered areas that are flooded typically daily, but beyond that, their range is really limited by temperature. So as temperatures increase with climate change and sea level rise, there is a chance that their range could potentially expand. Like other vegetated coastal ecosystems, mangroves are very well known for the range of ecosystem services they provide, and these are both on a local and a global scale. So locally, they're very important to protect coastal communities from cyclones and tidal waves. They're a source of natural products for these communities, and they're home to a wealth of biodiversity. They're particularly important as breeding sites and nursery grounds for a variety of animals, and they also provide connectivity with adjacent systems such as coral reefs and seagrasses. But on a global scale, although they don't have an enormous global coverage, around 150,000 square kilometres, they're very important stores of blue carbon, which helps to mitigate the effects of climate change. In this graph at the bottom of the slide, you can see 4 types of forest: boreal forest, temperate, tropical upland, and mangroves. And in this case, we're looking specifically at Indo-Pacific mangroves. And the grey area, the solid grey area, shows the amount of carbon which is stored in the soil below ground. And you can see that notably, it's almost 5 times that of the other forests. So they are significant blue carbon sinks. The mangrove environment is potentially an extreme and stressful environment for life. There are huge daily fluctuations in light, salinity, temperature, and nutrients, and of course, the tide too. In addition, the soil or sediment is waterlogged, highly saline, anoxic, and nutrient deficient. But mangroves are perfectly adapted to their environment, and they have they're among the most productive of all tropical forests. So some of the major adaptations include the ability to excrete excess salt through their leaves. And then they have lots of root adaptations. Because the sediment lacks oxygen, roots can't uptake this from below the surface. So they have to have special structures to be able to access oxygen even during high tide. And on the picture in the left, these are called pneumatophores, and they act a bit like a snorkel. So the trees can access oxygen even during high tide. And there are pores on these pneumatophores, which are water repellent, so the water can't enter them. In some species of mangroves, these structures can be up to 3 meters tall, but usually they're quite small, like this photo of a mangrove in Indonesia. There are several other types of root adaptation. On the right, these kind of arching rhizophora roots are probably very familiar to most people when you think about mangroves. And these are used for stability as well as improving oxygen uptake. And you can also see in the very front of the photo, there are knee roots, which are from another species of mangrove. So there are lots of root adaptations. The last adaptation I'm going to mention is reproduction. So the mangrove flowers once the mangrove flowers are pollinated, they produce seeds on the parent plant and germinate on the plant to form propagules. In this photo, I've shown 2 different types of propagules. So once they drop off the parent plant, they're immediately ready to root and grow, which is obviously very important considering the living environment, which is flooded by the tide twice a day. But another feature of propagules is that they can survive and disperse. They can survive for a long time and disperse very far. So this this figure at the bottom shows a model which was computed taking into account the ocean currents and how far a propagule could travel from its source, with each colour or line representing an individual propagule. The Rhizophora propagules, which are the ones in the top right, they can actually survive for up to 1 year floating around in the sea and then still be able to root and grow into a tree. So if you look off the coast of South America there, which is probably the easiest ones to see, you can see that they can actually disperse a very long way. So after the mangrove trees themselves, the second largest component of mangrove biomass is microorganisms, so bacteria, fungi, and archaea. And this figure shows the dry weight in grams per cubic meter of bacteria alone. And it's quite impressive compared to the mangrove trees, that it's so enormous. So in all soils and sediments, microorganisms are the drivers of nutrient and biogeochemical cycling, and they're responsible for distributing the key biological elements such as nitrogen and phosphorus. And so they're extremely important for the overall functioning of the ecosystem. And the mangrove fauna are the final component of this complex ecosystem I'm going to mention, and this encompasses a wide range of phyla, but the main contributors to macrofaunal biomass are mollusks, annelids, and crustacea. And within crustacea, this is mainly crabs. Mangrove crabs are highly diverse, and they're well known as ecosystem engineers. They termed this because they have a deep impact on the mangrove forest functionality, and they're extremely well studied. So the aim of my PhD was to put these three elements together, the animals, microorganisms, and trees, and to study how benthic fauna can modify the sediment environment and therefore the microorganisms within sediment, and to see if this might ameliorate the conditions for plant growth or in some way facilitate this. So let's look at what the crabs actually do in their mangrove environment. So collectively, all of the activities that crabs perform are termed bioturbation, because in doing so, they bioturbate the sediment. So firstly, we have grazing, and I'm hoping this little video should work. So in this video, we have a fiddler crab feeding on the sediment, and you can see all of the little feeding pellets on the ground, which the crab or other crabs have processed. And this graph shows different mangroves along the East African coast, and I'm going to pick out Gazi Bay here, which is a mangrove in Kenya. And following this bar, you can see that the mangrove crab community in this specific mangrove can process around 8 kilos of sediment per square meter per day. So just to put this into perspective, in a 60-hectare mangrove, which is the size of the Gazi Bay mangrove, the crab community can bioturbate and rework 139 fuel tanks of sediment each day. So it's a lot of sediment. Another activity that deeply impacts the mangrove floor is burrowing. Many crab species do this, but fiddler crabs, which are shown here, are unique in that they plug their burrows. So this video shows a fiddler crab in the Red Sea. These crabs are semi-terrestrial. So among the mangrove crabs, there are some which can only breathe in water and some which can breathe in air and water. And this group preferentially breathes in air. So when the tide comes in, they cut out this piece of mud and they plug themselves inside their burrows. And in doing so, as the water seeps up through the sediment, they trap a bubble of air inside so that they can keep breathing air during the high tide by keeping this bubble inside. But it's not only crabs that show this kind of behavior, and this is a clip from Life in the Undergrowth, which shows ants in an Australian mangrove. So at low tide, the ants move their larvae and pupae to different areas of the nest to keep them at the right temperature during the day. And then when the tide comes back in, they have to quickly work to move them back to safety in chambers of the burrow, because their burrows are very complex, where pockets of air get trapped, so to keep them out of the water at high tide. And towards the end of the video, as the tide starts to come in, you can see, if you look closely, you can see the bubble of air which gets trapped there right at the top of the burrow. And this is the same concept with the fiddler crab burrows. They keep this little bubble of air inside. So what does all of this crab, burrow maintenance, sorry, there's one more video. So this is an activity which it acts to mix deep anoxic sediment with surface sediment. So these, by maintaining their burrows, the crabs are moving all of the deep anoxic sediment and all of the microbes associated with that sediment onto the surface. So they're essentially mixing it. And this is done every day after the tide goes out again, to maintain their burrows and to repair them and to get them ready for the next tide comes in. And what does all this crab bioinformation do? On a small scale, perhaps not too much, but when you consider, and you can see in the video now, that these crabs can be found in densities of up to 100 per square meter for the small species, that impact starts to get amplified. So we designed an experiment to essentially dissect the burrows of different mangrove crab species along a latitudinal gradient from Saudi Arabia down to South Africa on a very fine scale, to look at firstly the changes in the sediment biochemistry and then the changes in the microorganism communities brought about by all of these bioturbation activities. So we looked on a millimeter scale, both horizontally down the burrow shaft and vertically away from the burrow, to get a radial profile. And in all of the sites that we studied, we saw the same pattern of burrow influence, with distinct and different microbial communities in every fraction of the burrow. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the microbial community composition and changes, but if anyone's interested, I'll be happy to share the links to the paper in the chat afterwards. But I do want to share this figure with you, which I will explain. So we used, at the same time as taking the sediment samples, we used microsensors to probe the same radial burrow profile and measure oxygen and redox in the sediment. And I appreciate it's a bit hard to pick up the detail in this figure, but just to explain, on the y-axis we have the depth. So the top is the mangrove surface, and then the different colours represent the distance from the burrow wall. And the black line is essentially the control. So this is where we have no crab burrowing. And what I want you to really notice here is that the black line and the bulk sediment, the control sediment, far away from the burrow, at around 3 millimeters depth here, the oxygen drops to 0 and it stays at 0 all the way down. Whereas if you look at all of the fractions around the burrow, so all the coloured lines, this is quite variable. It does drop to 0, but then it goes up again. And this is the biggest impact that the crabs have on the microbial community, because they're introducing, by burrowing, they're introducing oxygen where it normally would not be. And you can see on the right, the effect of this on the redox around the burrow is that it's very negative. Again, the black, which is the control line, away from the burrow, but it stays positive even down to depths in all of the burrow fractions. And this is really crucial because the redox is what drives microbe metabolism, and it causes shifts in the nutrient cycling and has a cascade effect as you move away from the burrow. But there are also crabs doing other things in mangroves. This is a large semi-terrestrial burrower, which is able to bury up to 4 times its weight in mangrove litter daily. It's a sesamid crab, and it has a very important ecological role. Due to its size, it makes very large burrows. They're very wide because they're bigger crabs and they're very deep, but it has a very important role in carbon storage. They can remove up to 70 to 80% of the forest ground litter. In fact, in mangroves where you have high population densities of these crabs, the forest floor is very clean, because as soon as something drops, whether it's a propagule or a leaf, they grab it and they shred it and they bury it in their burrow to eat it later. So this carbon is not lost with the tide. It doesn't get washed out to sea. It's retained inside the burrow, deep in the sediment. And this figure from a review paper basically summarizes this kind of research that we did on the crab burrows, although this could apply to any burrowing animal in the mangroves, not just crabs, and it shows what we termed the halo effect. So this effect is estimated to affect up to 80% of mangrove sediment in mangroves where you have a high crab density, and it has big implications for biogeochemical cycling and ecosystem functioning. So at the burrow surface, there are impacts of surface activities such as grazing, but these effects also extend down the burrow shaft and away from the burrow shaft, because the burrows are either flush with air at low tide or with seawater at high tide. But then there are different features, for example, the storage of leaves, which we've just shown, which increases the abundance of fungi deep in the sediment, which wouldn't normally be there without the burrow, and this helps degrade organic matter. So all of these bioturbation activities together change the microbial abundance, diversity, and the nutrient cycling. So having identified the impact of the animals on the microbes in the sediment, we wanted to sort of close the circle and address what's termed the plant productivity paradox in mangroves, which is essentially how can the mangroves be so productive? So as I mentioned earlier, the mangrove environment is characterized by so many sources of plant stress, but their productivity actually rivals that of tropical rainforests. So as we've seen, they're physiologically very well adapted, but there's a lot of evidence and research that suggests that interactions between plants and animals may help to buffer stress. So to look at the impact of bioturbation and plant growth, we monitored mangrove plots with different levels of crab density. This was an experiment we ran for a year and a half, and we sampled and we had plots with different levels of crab bioturbation, which is essentially crab density or burrow density. So we had high, low, and no crabs at all. And we sampled the sediment for the sediment chemistry and microbial communities, and we also monitored the growth of plants in these different levels of bioturbation. So again, without going into too much detail about the actual microbial community analysis, this plot on the right shows every dot is essentially a sediment sample, and the microbial communities significantly differed in composition with each level of bioturbation. So as we might expect, where there was no bioturbation, they were more different to the different levels, but the high level of bioturbation and low level caused a different microbial community composition. And more than that, looking at the growth of the plants, we monitored the height of the trees, the branch diameter, and then the number of pneumatophores, which are the root extensions I mentioned earlier. So in all of these growth parameters, these were positively correlated with the crab number. So essentially, more crabs meant more plant growth. And this is summarized in this figure, which, I mean, it's quite a complicated figure, but just to simplify it, this is showing that the crab bioturbation helps the mangrove plant growth and development, and this occurs through two sort of pathways. So on the left, there's the fact that the crabs modify the sediment and the chemical properties, which modifies the nutrients which are available to the plants. And on the right, there's the side where the crabs drive a change in the composition of the functionality of bacterial communities, and this alters nutrient cycling. And since this study was published last year, it's now also been identified that crabs can cause the plants to select, or let's say pick up, beneficial plant growth promoting bacteria from the sediment that can help them survive and thrive in this complex ecosystem. So in this way, this is helping to explain this paradox of plant productivity, the effect that the animals have to help the plants. So all of this is particularly relevant. It can kind of be framed within the fact that mangroves are threatened ecosystems. And it's always kind of good to put in some startling statistics, I think. So 1/3 of the world's mangroves have been lost in the last 50 years. 2% are lost each year to deforestation, and the loss to shrimp rearing ponds and oil palm plantations is one of the biggest problems, particularly kind of in the Southeast Asian mangroves. But there are, of course, other impacts from coastal urbanization, such as sewage, contaminants, and oil spills. And the bigger issue is that with this loss of mangroves, or even just the degradation, it's not just that we're losing the biodiversity, but we're losing all of the ecosystem services that I mentioned earlier. So, for example, coastal communities rely on fisheries for their revenue and food. So you have this loss of the loss of this ecosystem service, which is important locally for the people that live there. But then on a global scale, of course, mangrove degradation means loss of blue carbon assets, which are vital as we're facing the ongoing effects of climate change. And it's not just the loss of carbon stores or potential carbon stores, but the subsequent release of CO2 once these are chopped down, which then all of this carbon that we spoke about before, which is stored in the sediment, that then gets released into the atmosphere. So beyond reducing deforestation, something useful that we can do is the assessment and monitoring of mangrove ecosystem health. And this is really important in order to preserve these ecosystem services that we've talked about. So tying this in with the research and information I've presented today, a benthic community indicator, and by this I mean the composition and diversity of animals which are living on the mangrove floor, can be a really good tool to measure the restoration and conservation success, but also as an early detector of environmental degradation, so sort of like a warning system. So for example, in mangroves in East Africa, anomalies or changes in the diversity and biomass of benthic communities have been linked to anthropogenic inputs, that specifically sewage levels. So the concept is that for species which are sensitive to contaminants or other anthropogenic inputs, changes in their community composition can be useful to detect a loss of habitat quality. And as a final thought to end on, this type of benthic community indicator could be potentially very useful to detect anthropogenic impacts and degradation in mangroves in the UK overseas territories, because it's something that's very easy to monitor. It's identifying crabs or the benthic community and counting them. It's low tech, no technology required. It requires very minimal expertise or training. It would just be to learn to identify the animals, and it's very low cost. So this could be a very useful tool. And it was a bit of a short presentation. That's my last slide. So I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jenny. That was so interesting. And I think I said before, very much appreciated the crab videos. They were very cute and very funny. We've got a few questions on the Jamboard, which is great. So if you're all good, I can fire through some of those. And if you've got any more questions, please feel free to keep popping them on. We've got a bit of time. So yes. So let's go with, there's one question asking what redox is.
Okay, so basically it's I'll try and give a clear explanation of this. It's measured, and I'll go back to that. Hang on, I'm still in presentation mode, aren't I?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just go back to that slide quickly. So it's measured in millivolts, and it's basically affected by the amount of oxygen in the sediment. So if you have a change in redox level, it changes the kind of functional groups of bacteria which will be working at that time. So at a certain level, it changes the electron acceptors, which would be selected by that bacteria. So maybe where there's lots of oxygen is very favorable in a positive environment. So the bacteria there would preferentially be using oxygens as an electron acceptor. And this kind of has a cascade effect. So as you lose your oxygen and the redox decreases, there are other things which would be used by the bacteria for their metabolism. It's probably not a perfect answer. This is my understanding of it, but if someone has a better explanation, I'd be happy to hear that.
No, that was great. Thank you. Okay, we've got another question saying, sorry if I missed this, but what countries did your research cover?
Okay, so the research was, I did my PhD at Kaust in Saudi Arabia. So a lot of the research was in different mangroves in Saudi Arabia. And then for the experiments on the burrows, we went down to South Africa So we had a northerly site in Saudi Arabia, a southerly one, and then the bottom in South Africa, which kind of covered the two, almost the exact latitudinal extremes of the mangroves.
Okay, thank you. We've still got some more questions coming in, which is great. One question is, what environmental parameters limit or threaten crab populations within mangroves?
That's a good question. So one of the actual issues which I didn't mention is, rather than sea level rise, it's sea level reduction. So for example, in with the oscillations you get because through El Nino years, and the other one with the name escapes me, the opposite of the El Nino years, and when you have a very low sea level, actually you can get a lot of mangrove loss. So for example, in Saudi Arabia, we have the case where you can get a drop in the sea level and the tide just simply for several months of the year does not reach those mangroves, and the trees can often survive, but crabs which are living in that band, they would not necessarily be threatened by that, but they would shift kind of their range. So the sea level is probably the parameter that would affect it most. And not they live in very warm areas, so not really temperature. I mean, in Saudi we measured sediment temperatures of even up to 50 degrees, and the crabs are kind of out and about. But I would say the biggest kind of threat is probably the sea level, if they have nowhere they can relocate to. So if there are lower down mangroves where they could go and burrow, that would be okay. But if there are no mangroves, then this could possibly be a problem.
Okay, but there is a question about, is there a particular crab species that is better for the mangroves?
That's another good question. I would say not particularly. So you very rarely, you don't really get kind of one crab or a few crabs that are only found. It's really a complex community of lots of different types of crabs that I didn't show. So they're communities of crabs rather than one species, but the action of burrowing, and it can be a crab or it could be a gastropod or a mud lobster or anything. It's the creation of the burrows really which is having the big impact, and different crabs do have different effects. So you have obviously the crabs which bury the carbon, but without those, it's not necessary to say that it would have a negative effect on the mangroves. There will be other kind of burrows that leaves will just get trapped in, and without the crabs dragging them in there. But it's really it's a very diverse and kind of complex community of crabs performing different functions. But definitely the burrow structure is what's really having the big impact there. Yeah.
Okay. There's one here that says, you said with rising temperatures and sea levels, mangroves may increase globally, but are there enough suitable habitats or undeveloped coastlines where this could actually happen?
Well, this is another good question. This ties in with the threats. That is one of the potential risks. So in theory, they could expand, but if we obviously build all the way along to the coastline, there's nowhere for them to expand to. So in unpopulated areas, potentially yes, but this should be very well considered in terms of kind of marine spatial planning, and for any development on the coast. We don't want to lose the mangroves for lots of reasons. It's not logical to build on the coast and lose the thing that's protecting you from all of these things such as sea level rise. But obviously people continue to do it because there's nowhere else to build. But if there is something there, then no, they can't expand. So it's something that needs to be very carefully considered when any kind of development's happening on the coast.
Did you come across any instances where that was like considered in development plans?
I think it depends probably on the country. So I know, for example, in Saudi, because that's where I've worked, it's something which is assessed and reported on, but whether that's actually then used in the development, that's a different thing. So I think there's a bit of a case of if we remove the mangroves and build here, it's okay because they can just spread a bit further along the coast, which possibly they can, but that's not necessarily the best thing. But yeah, if you're looking at, I don't know, in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, where you've had massive clearance for like the oil palms and shrimp ponds and this type of thing, they are now, there's a lot of restoration work because people are seeing the huge benefits of having them rather than losing them. So yeah, I would say it's very country specific, but definitely people are interested in that advice, but what they do with the advice is possibly a different situation.
Yeah, it sounds like it's maybe moving in the right direction, just slowly.
Yes, yeah. Let's be
Which is-
positive about it.
Yeah. Okay. Another question here. What's the furthest away the pneumatophores can be from the tree?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to, unfortunately. If I just if I go back to this slide at the beginning. So I mean, this is probably about 10 meters away from that tree, so definitely 10 meters. I don't know how much further away they can go from that, but because there is obviously so little oxygen as soon as you go even centimeters down, the mangroves do have apart from the aerial roots, just very, very shallow, expansive roots, and then they send these up. So yes, I would say definitely 10 meters, but I'm afraid I don't know the exact answer to that.
No, that's great. Someone's put that there will be a big focus on mangroves at COP27, which I believe is called the Mangrove Breakthrough, being launched today at COP27 by the UN, if you did not know that.
That's interesting. Yeah,
thank you for that. Someone else has asked, do you know any conservation projects where community is involved in assessing the mangrove forests, for example, so the community understand the value of the mangroves?
I'm not aware of any, but I'm sure that I should imagine there are quite a lot. There's, especially as I mentioned, in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, there's a lot of mangrove restoration and conservation projects, and obviously just because of where they occur, I mean, you can't really do that without involving the community. So I don't know the answer to that, but I imagine there is a lot of community involvement in that. Yeah.
And someone else has asked, how is climate change affecting the distribution and richness of different mangrove plant species?
Again, I don't know the exact answer, but I would guess that considering they really follow that pattern of essentially where it's, well, not necessarily warmer, but in the tropics, in the very hot tropics, you have higher richness. And where it's cooler, you tend to have lower richness. I suppose that I don't know if mangroves can keep up with climate warming in terms of kind of the spread of the richness. So that's a good question. I don't know the answer, but there's definitely the pattern that in the cooler areas there is less richness, but I don't know that that shift can kind of match itself temporarily.
Okay, and someone else has asked, how do replanted or restored mangroves compare for the rate of bioturbations and associated communities of microorganisms, benthic species, etc.? I guess to those that have been there for a long time.
So there is some research underway about this, which I don't have the results or kind of a publication about this yet, but this has been done in Indonesia in mangroves which have been restored after they've been cleared for shrimp ponds. So I'm afraid I can't answer that, but I would imagine it's sort of a bit like the mangroves. It's actually, when we did the experiment in Saudi with the putting the plots, and we also did, I didn't show the results, but we enriched, we planted mangroves where there were no mangroves, and we enriched them with crab species and kind of monitored that density to look at the effect on growing plantlets. And where you put crabs, they do tend to stay because they burrow and they have a very high fidelity to their burrows. So if they're in a good place, they don't really have a reason to kind of go away. But I don't know how long it would take them to kind of reach that area. I mean, something interesting would be obviously to start thinking about physically moving or repopulating restored mangroves with crab communities, because if they've got a good place to stay, there's no reason why they would not thrive there. But I don't know the results of that research yet, but it's definitely something people are looking at now. Yeah.
Do people generally, when they're planning for like mangrove restoration and stuff, say in like Southeast Asia, in these areas, do they think about restoring, like doing what you did and moving in crab communities as well?
I've not heard of it, but that's not to say it hasn't happened. I don't know. It's definitely something. It's something interesting because I mean they're extremely important part of the system. We struggled to find areas when we wanted to look at areas with plants but no crabs. It's difficult to find mangrove, even patches of mangrove where there are no crabs, because they are so abundant. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. And I think it's just one last question. Feel free to pop any more in if anyone's got anyone, because we've still got time. Why do some areas of the planet have higher species richness when the seeds can travel such large distances? And with increasing global temperatures, is the richness also likely to increase?
Yeah, so I guess that kind of like links in with the previous one. I would assume that yes, it will, though I don't know how long that would take, the richness would kind of take to sort of catch up. The dispersal, that obviously is modeled. So it's Rhizophora, that species of mangrove, which can survive for up to a year. The other propagules, I think it's around 7 days. So it's unlikely that all species would get dispersed that far. But for sure, it's obviously good for, that's one of the adaptations, is great for connectivity and obviously spreading. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that one.
And we've just got another question come in. Are there any threats to mangroves from invasive species, crabs or plant-wise, that you came across in your PhD?
Not that I came across my PhD. I'm just trying to have a think. Not that I can, definitely not animals that I can. I mean, there are invasive species in mangroves, but not crabs that I'm aware of, and not that would necessarily have have a negative impact on the community, because essentially they're just doing that job of bioturbating and all that kind of good stuff that comes along with it. In terms of trees, and again, not that I am aware of, no. But again, that's not to say could not be the case.
Do you know what the invasive species are generally that are within mangroves?
Oh, now you've asked me a question. No, I don't. I mean, mangroves, there's that nursery grounds for so many species of fish, sponge, anything you can think of. So yeah, I'm sure, and mussels, all sorts of things. So I'm sure there will be some, but yeah, I'm not aware that they have any negative impacts. I didn't come across anything in my PhD, no.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think that is all the questions, unless anyone has anything else they would like to ask. No? Okay.
Silence.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again, Jenny. That was really interesting. It was great to learn all about the mangroves. I guess if people have any other further questions or anything, we can just put them in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if you want, didn't want to go into too much heavy detail on the science bit, but if anyone wants any kind of references or links to papers, I'm happy to share them with you. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jenny. And thank you everyone for coming along. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.